This is session 8 of today's Left Bank event, which is mobilising social actors to fight the environmental crisis. And as you can see, we're joined by 3 incredible panellists today. I'm going to keep my introductions nice and brief and allow our panellists to introduce themselves in a little bit more detail themselves. So beside me, I have Professor Mary Murphy, who is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Maynooth University. Mary has previously served as Commissioner in the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission and is currently a member of the Council of State, and her current book is Creating an Eco-Social Welfare Future. And then next is Sadhbh O'Neill, and Sadhbh is the coordinator of Stop Climate Chaos, and Sadhbh's going to tell us a little bit more about that. And then at the end we have Lisa Fingleton, who is an artist, filmmaker, writer and grower, who has spent over 20 years cultivating connections between art, food and farming. Lisa has recently published 2 books and has an MA in documentary film, and Lisa is also a lead artist on 2 of the Creative Climate Action projects. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Mary. Thank you so much.
Hi everybody, I'm conscious we're last in what's been a long day and that there's a lovely sun out there for the first time in ages. I suppose what I primarily wanted to talk to takes from the content of the book I recently published, Creating an Eco-Social Welfare Future. And the last third of that talks about the politics of change and trying to mobilise around. And the first thing I suppose I would say is I would change the title of the session with respect to mobilising social actors to fight the environmental and inequality crisis. And I would do that in an attempt to get a different frame around what we're trying to do, who we're trying to bring into the conversation, and what we're trying to talk about. Because ultimately the argument would be that we are all quite still fractured and styloed in the different bits that we pursue in our own political activism, and that unless we have a more systemic overall frame to how we create the conversation about what we want to talk about and mobilise around, that we won't do it inclusively and we won't do it in a broad enough way to have the political impact that we want. So I'm very much coming from a sense that like the conjoined nature of the problem in environmental degradation and social and economic inequality, and that you've got to find solutions that really get over both of them together and move in the direction of tackling both of them together. I say that because I really do believe that if we press ahead with things to tackle environmental degradation without taking into account inequality, we could well reinforce and deepen inequality and create the kind of problems you were probably talking about in the last panel as well. So I think we really need to put that firmly on the agenda. But what I want to talk today is the difficulties of doing that, and the difficulties that even if you accept that argument and try and organise with that broad intent, the difficulties that you come into. And as I see it, I'm going to talk about 4 difficulties. The difficulties of different types of organisations, groups, individuals working across different types of theories of change or understandings of how change happens that explicitly or implicitly leads them into getting in each other's way in terms of organising. The dangers are the difficulties of actually inclusive participation and inclusive mobilisation, the difficulties of leadership that needs to be longer term in its vision of what it's trying to achieve, and the issue of democracy itself being very much at stake with all of them. And in terms of, I know Lisa is going to do the visuals and be much more creative, but if you want to take away one takeaway from this that is a visual, it's that when we're trying to mobilise, that we need to be talking about the brownie, the what do people want, what the for in people's lives, the vision of the future that can really be attractive to people, and less talking about the recipe, which is how we make it happen. I think in terms of changing the conversation about what we might need to do. So the book I wrote, I largely wrote it because I did feel in the sector that I'm largely in, which is around poverty, economic inequality and other forms of inequality, that we are not talking enough about climate change in that sector. And I really wanted to try and offer a frame for people to come into the conversation in a way that that really spoke to their own experience. So to bring welfare and welfare conversations into the conversation about climate change a little bit more, and in that way contribute to joining the dots. But what I want to start with then is the importance of, well, just understanding that we do have different models of change, and there's a real genuine practical difficulty in mobilising social actors when they're working implicitly or explicitly with different understandings of how change happens. And just to give you a practical example that I've seen a lot at the EU level is, in the EU, there's competence in relation to environmental policy. The EU can make hard law. So the environmental groups are doing certain types of actions that are quite sensible in the context of the way the EU works for that. Whereas in social policy, labour market policy, gender policy, the EU has only soft law, and the NGOs that need to mobilise around trying to get EU policy in that area have to do different things to make that happen. So they're often not in the same spaces, they're not often doing the same things, and they often talk past each other. So if you bring that down to a national level, I think often we're looking at quite different spaces to try and influence, and different strategies make sense in that way. But I think while we all probably have an analysis that speaks to the same thing, largely about reducing the size of the market and increasing the role of the state and enhancing societal's capacity to address social inequalities and climate change. A lot of us do it through different political traditions of organising, and I'm very conscious, like I'm at a social democratic think tank here, but Eric Alwyn Wright's work I think is really valuable here, and he recognises that even though there are a lot of people who would claim they're working for progressive change, some are working forward in a more ruptural or kind of revolutionary tradition, some of it are working forward in a more anarchist or interstitial kind of way of working, and then you get more social democratic traditions that are more maybe incremental or evolutionary in how they might see change coming about. So while all those actors are in the same direction, they are actually doing quite different things, and they often quite misunderstand each other's motivations and agendas and what we do. So we not only get in each other's way and create silos between ourselves, but the narcissism of those small differences can actually be quite sharp sometimes in stopping us talking to each other and stopping us co-organising. And just a quote from Andrew Mann and How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and I'm not sure I totally agree with him, but he talked about the tension, the inevitable tension of co-organising in the context of a plurality of diverse tactics. And I think that's very true, and that we need to be much more reflective about what that means. I think one of the other big obstacles that there is just that sense of inclusive models of participation, that often we do get into policy debates that, like it or not, can often end up being quite elitist to the ear of the person who is experiencing the problem and who's not sharing the language or the knowledge frames or the experiential knowledge that people in the room might have. So a lot of the feminist movements, the disability movement, movements around racism, they all talk about the need to check our language, check our privilege, and to really orientate the words we're using and the frames we're using to be inclusive. And I think, I mean, I know I'm guilty of, but I also see examples for environmental and inequality campaigns that were not inclusive and that really divided people instead of bringing them together. I think the other big kind of issue that we're facing collectively, both environmental movements and inequality movements, is the impact that austerity and a rather vindictive state policy since then around civil society more generally has had on our collective capacity to mobilise, and that has pushed us towards leadership strategies and organisational strategies that are much more about survival in the short term, and picking staff and picking leaders who can do that, who can get in the money, who can play the game that's required in the context of a narrowing down of the space to organise, and in the context of a state that really does sometimes inhibit and suppress advocacy and mobilisation. So there's that context which is actually really hard to do. And I think that's really hard, and I think the relationship between that space, that civil society space, and other spaces of democracy, including political parties, is really important to keep that conversation going about how those impacts are understood and how some of those policies need to be rolled back depending on who gets into power. I talk about the idea of a high energy democracy, one where state policy facilitates mobilisation and active participation of citizens rather than inhibits it. And the last thing I want to just conclude with is that issue of democratic mobilisation itself, and it probably came up in the last session. I'm sure that, you know, the degree to which that a lot of the responses to the tensions around climate change and the inequality crisis is getting populist and how it's pushing out democratic responses. And indeed, even from within our own sectors, we do hear more and more that the urgency is crowding out the luxury of democracy, and how we need to pursue the urgency of some of the solutions that we need in ways that maybe rule out some of the democratic participation. And I really think we need to be really careful around that democratic participation it's both intrinsic, it's a value in itself, but it's also instrumental in that we will not do the right thing without doing it in the right way and through the right processes. So we really need to make that road by walking, and that's going back to talking about the brownie and bringing people with us, maybe not so much the recipe in terms of the detailed policy debates, but certainly bringing people in the direction of travel and making sure people are with us. And to do that, we really have to adopt that whole systems approach, which is talking about the whole thing and not siloed bits of the thing. We need to really be careful about including as many actors as we can in that, and reflecting people's everyday concerns and people's everyday language. So I guess to conclude, and I've only got 10 minutes, so I don't even know, I'm probably, just that sense of being more reflective about how our own theories of change may get in the way of inclusive mobilisation or effective mobilisation across broader actors. The need to watch our language in terms of inclusive dialogue and engaging in forms of dialogue that people can hear their own life experiences in. The need for serious leadership, even in the context of the flattening of civil society, and the need to maintain a firm handle on whatever we're doing has to be democratic, and not giving away that space. I think they're all really important to focus on our ways of trying to mobilise around environmental and inequality crisis. Thanks.
Hi everybody, my name is Sadhbh O'Neill and I'm here as the coordinator of the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, which is a civil society coalition formed in 2007 to fight for fairer and faster climate action. I've also been involved in some research here at DCU, and I've done a variety of other things and have a long background in campaigning on environmental and climate issues over the last few decades. So it's wonderful to be here. It really is exciting to be talking to people who value activism on the ground and are doing things in their community, you know, politically and otherwise to make a better world, to put it simply. So this topic is obviously very timely. So just to give you a kind of a sense of where we're at. So the climate movement has actually been around for a long time, but it has had a kind of a roller coaster sort of trajectory. For example, people forget this, but in 2014, right before the Paris COP, which obviously led to the signing of this very important Paris Agreement, 400,000 people marched in New York in advance of that COP. So there was a huge presence on the street. And that obviously signaled very clearly to political leaders that there was public support for international action on climate change, and domestically as well. But obviously, after the Paris Agreement was signed, there was a sort of backpedaling in many countries. And then the publication of the really landmark IPCC report came out in 2018 on the danger of 1.5 degrees of warming. And this had been signalled in the Paris Agreement, but then they sent off the IPCC to research it. Well, you know, is 1.5 feasible? What would the impacts be? And the answer was that it would be absolutely devastating if global warming was allowed to exceed that limit. So the 2-degree temperature limit in the Paris Agreement was kind of almost sidelined in favour of the pursuing the 1.5. And that in turn signalled, I suppose, a wave of media publicity and concern about the science is really getting scary now. All of that led to Greta Thunberg starting her school strike and the marches that evolved globally very rapidly. So there's a sense that there's always a latent support for on the street action, you know, mobilization around climate change, but people are waiting for someone else to organize it. And of course, the establishment of Extinction Rebellion, I think, is actually a very, very important historical moment in the evolution of climate movement. because it was a very different type of organisation, both in terms of its theory of change, but in its mode of operation and its kind of agenda and the way it seeked to be disruptive, unlike the work of the kind of established environmental movement, which is about talking to government, talking to the public, while being very polite and reasonable. And Extinction Rebellion turned that upside down in a really exciting way. Not that it's been easy for them. But then, of course, COVID struck. So we saw a green wave in 2019. The European elections, the local elections, the Greens broke through, as well as the Soc Dems in these elections and in 2020. But of course, we had COVID, and that set the sort of on-the-street mobilisation of the public back quite considerably. And of course, since 2020, we've had some significant developments in terms of law and governance of the climate policy agenda. And I won't go into all of that because you're all probably very familiar with it. But obviously, those are very important and necessary, but not sufficient instruments to drive the policy changes that are needed. And in terms of mobilising the public, well, it's all very well campaigning to get a law, but implementing it is a whole other thing. It's a whole other set of political challenges. And that's what the space we're in at the moment. We're also dealing with the backlash. Now, this has been coming for a long time. You can trace the roots of it. The far-right movements in various countries have been simmering away for decades, but they seized their opportunity, perhaps in 2020 with the election of Trump and everything that's happened since then, and are capitalising on the sort of sometimes tortured debates in climate policy about what needs to be done and who will be affected by it. They all need to happen. All those debates need to happen, and we need to tease out the implications of these policies, very detailed. But the way that the debates have been framed and the way that they have been weaponized increasingly on social media by various far-right movements seeking to, use these issues to organize people in all kinds of sometimes quite unrelated stuff, to do with migration, conspiracy theories, climate denial, throwing everything into this big toxic soup that's very difficult. I came across a brilliant quote in an article in the New York Times the other day, and it was actually that woman, I can't remember her name, Deborah something, who wrote a book about Holocaust denial, and she said, you just can't debate these people. It's like trying to nail jelly to a wall. And that is what it's like trying to debate with people who have fixed in their minds that this is all some sort of agenda by global elites, by Bill Gates, or by eco-zealots to, force 15-minute cities on us. And while all of that is daft and nonsense, you'd be amazed at how much traction it gets in the public mind. And of course, for the average person, they don't have to believe 100% of it. They just have to latch on to one or two notions and get suspicious then about the kind of policies that they hear about. So the backlash is happening. It's important. We have to look at what's happened in Germany with their proposed phasing out, not a ban, of gas boilers. That was weaponized by the AfD, and we will see similar things happen in Ireland. We don't have any phase-out date, by the way, and that is a really critical thing in climate policy. Everything needs to be timetabled, and all of these decisions need to be mapped out well in advance so that everybody knows what's happening, so that people don't put in new gas boilers if there's going to be phase out or if it's going to become extremely expensive. But also that you give people plenty of notice and that we put in place the supports, everything else, all the funding that has to happen. But if we don't have a public debate that's sensible and problem solving in its direction, the danger is that all of these moments will become potential bananas for governments to slide on, for policymakers to trip over and make a mess of. So for people like me, that's our job to make sure that doesn't happen, that we kind of engage with the government and we engage with the public in ways that kind of make this all sensible and transparent and practical. And to a certain extent, and this is where some of that brilliant talk you gave there, Mary, and it's so important to hear all this, but sometimes in terms of policy work on environment and climate, sometimes we need to depoliticize certain topics, and sometimes we need to politicize them. Depends on the issue, it depends on the time. So it requires very careful campaigning, and that when I say campaigning, I don't just mean civil society, but also by political actors as well. So who are the enemies as well? That's the other thing, right? So the fossil fuel industry, absolutely the enemy. But we also have big agriculture, and the right-wing movements, as I say, are capitalizing on a lot of the discontent among certain farmer groups. Now, I just want to say one thing about public opinion. When you look at the opinion polls around climate action and environment, there is very broad levels of public support across all demographics and all regions. It's slightly higher in Dublin and it's slightly higher amongst women, but really not all that significant. It's not significantly different between urban and rural areas. But none of that makes its way up into the public debate. So different groups are being pitted against each other. And while it's important, as I say, to tease out the implications for marginalized group of any policy, sometimes that is being done so that people are taking advantage of those differences in order to drive and sow division in society. So it's important to note that while there's broad levels of support across urban and rural areas, there is a pocket of resistance that you can see visibly in the opinion polls that does not accept some of the climate science or the implications of it in amongst farmers. And I just wanted to mention that because I thought your leader, Holly Cairns, when she came out and spoke to that, was actually extremely brave. She's in a rural constituency. There will be a political price for anybody who tries to challenge that at a local level, but that's exactly what needs to be done. And we, in the campaigning side, are always hearing from farmers who are really concerned about the kind of conspiracy theories and the talk of rural parties and all of that that's coming up. They're very concerned about that, but it's very hard for them to go public because they don't want to be going against their peers and their colleagues and their friends, their local community. So it's a very, very difficult one, and hats off to you guys and to Holly for speaking out in that way. So just wanted to make a couple of other points, and it dovetails absolutely with what Mary was saying there. So in terms of framing and in terms of messaging, I could talk to you all day about different environmental policies, but the overriding theme as we head into the next round of elections, and this is what we'll be doing, and I'm hoping you might do as well, is to focus on the messaging and the narratives around environmental justice, about well-being, about what's good for everybody, whether it's in terms of our health or community structures, addressing inequalities and addressing them not just in terms of income, but in terms of, and not just in terms of public services, but also the impacts of pollution, because they are totally neglected in Irish environmental policy and in public discourse. Children, young people and older people are particularly vulnerable to pollution, air pollution particularly, but also people living in really dreadful housing conditions are especially vulnerable to all of that. All the obvious reasons are all the transport, poverty and everything else that goes with it. We all know this. This is in the sort of very practical local political landscape that you're dealing with, but it doesn't get politicized. So these are things that do need to be politicized. It's a question of justice. There are communities on the Dart line where it's quite normal to have 5 cars in a driveway right beside the Dart. And there are other people with no public transport 20 minutes away from a bus stop. And it's just absolutely outrageous that that's still the case. And never mind those who don't have any public transport at all. So as we head into an era of increasing frequency of climate crisis, we have to absolutely socialize the message that no one must be left behind. I would encourage you to listen to a podcast that I heard yesterday. It's the New York Times Daily, and it's a podcast that they have out every day. And yesterday they interviewed this young man who had survived the wildfires in Maui, and it was absolutely breathtaking. You have to be sitting down listening to this, don't be driving. It's shocking and frightening and very upsetting, actually, very distressing. And he talked about, racing to the sea to get away from the flames, and how he heard people screaming as they were literally exploding. They were burning up, and he couldn't see anything because it was so dark, but essentially he was able to leave because he had a scooter. He had his neighbour on the back who was too old and overweight basically to make his own way to the sea, and he saved that man's life. So in a climate crisis, we have to be thinking kind of like Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts about who we can help, how we can help them, how we can make sure that nobody is left behind. Those kind of disasters happen very quickly. So you don't have time to prepare. You need to have them institutionalized in communities about how to prepare for disaster response. Now, hopefully that sort of thing won't happen in Ireland, but something else will. Floods, that kind of thing. They happen very quickly. Do we have the social structures in place to make sure that nobody's not left behind? Nobody is left behind. So just to conclude, I could talk all day about policies. So in terms of the big overriding things in climate and environment, firstly, technologies are very important, and we can't afford to be technology averse. But all technologies sit within some sort of political paradigm. Now, we won't get into the theory behind that. So it's right to critique technology, who owns it, who's proposing it, where it's going, why this, not something else, absolutely. But the idea that we can solve these problems without technology is unfortunately naive at this stage. So obviously I'm talking about renewables in a big way, massively. And we're going to have to get our heads around that as people who are concerned about how to make sure that this new infrastructure is introduced in an acceptable way that's environmentally friendly and that doesn't disadvantage or impoverish anybody. And that creates opportunities for people as well, for community energy. Secondly, fiscal policy. Taxation is very important. It's not nice to be taxed. Nobody likes taxes, but taxing pollution is and can be very effective. It can always be made less regressive or not regressive, depending on how they're introduced. And we are looking into the future now. Next government will probably be forced to introduce, if we don't deal with our transport emissions on time, to introduce some sort of congestion charges. So that's a big fight that's going to happen. And it'll be on your watch. So what's your response going to be? How are you going to engage with that? It is possible to introduce congestion charges fairly. In fact, the ones in London have worked very well. And they were fair because they gave people scrappage. It was about nitrous oxide pollution, not just climate emissions. So they were giving people grants to change their cars. So there are often ways around the regressive nature of taxing pollution. And finally, I had one final point. The land use area is going to be really important in Ireland because we've basically very little land in public ownership. What land we do have is forested by Cllr. We have very little in the way of national parks. All the land that's farmed is privately owned. It's a whole other conversation I'm sure Lisa will get into, but there's issues there about how we direct the kind of changes that are necessary with land use. We need to make our farming sector make a very abrupt transition. There's a huge resistance to it, but it's not going to be just for the sake of climate change. It's also because we are suffering from widespread ecological collapse. And if we don't address that, we are going to lose all of our native biodiversity. So it involves really significant changes. It'll involve public money, and it will also have to involve more land somehow coming into state ownership. Otherwise, it might end up being abandoned, which is not necessarily what we want. So I'll stop there. Sorry for going on.
Are we good? Great. Okay, so I am going to read a little bit because I have so many things I want to say today that I'll either end up depressing you all or crying or doing something terrible. So I'm going to actually use notes for the first time I think I ever do a presentation, because it's taken me 8 to 9 hours to get here and I only have 10 minutes. And I was just wondering, would you be up for a bit of interaction with me if I use 2 of my minutes to interact with you? Would that be good? Great. Great. So look, first of all, just thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. The multiple crises in which we find ourselves in terms of climate and biodiversity make it incredibly challenging to do this in 10 minutes, but I will do my best. And I suppose, like our previous speakers have said, that these two crises, in my opinion, have the most enormous ramifications for justice and human rights in every area of our lives. And my work, all of my life, has been about community development, working in anti-racism, working in LGBTQI issues. And I suppose I've decided in the last couple of years that I'm going to really throw myself into working on climate action, because I feel that that's what's going to impact all of those issues in ways that we can't even imagine. And I suppose the tragedy for me in terms of someone who's so committed to human rights is that the people who did the least to cause the problems are the people who are going to be impacted most. And that's what drives me every day to do this work, no matter how hard it is. And the fact that so many species are gone already and we will never get them back. And I have a friend who's been out trying to save the last curlew nest in Kerry, and it failed. But they were there for 24 hours every day. And I just find that intolerable. So I've worked as a community worker, a grower, an organic grower, an artist at various stages throughout my life with many communities, not just in Ireland, but around the world. And in my opinion, I was trying to simplify it here today. So in my opinion, because I realised you're going to be at the end of your time here. Have you got it there? Yeah, we have, yeah. So we'll go back to that. So I'm going to make it really simple. I'm going to focus on what you can take away from today, I hope. So in my opinion, there are three things we can do. We can care. Sounds really basic, but we can care, and we can build connections and community, and we can use our creativity to bring about transformation, and we will be singing after this. So I'm hoping that everybody here is already doing a lot of those three things, but I'd love to do a little test on that for the next 2 minutes. Is that okay? Just so we feel like we're mobilised and we're going out. And I think the danger with a lot of this is that we can become powerless, and we can become actually paralysed by the fear of Storm Betty and everything else. So I want you to leave here with a sense of power. So what I just want to test is, can everybody just put their hands up really high? 2 hands. So this is like yes, 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 but I'm only going to ask you to lift one hand, all right? So one hand high up means you really feel strongly about this, or this is something I really do and I feel really strongly about. If you're kind of wavering, you can go here. And if it's down on your lap, it means, God, no, I don't agree with that at all, or I don't do it. Is that okay? Just because it's visual and it gets us to do something. So a very strong hand is that. And you can be anywhere in between. And please, there's no judgment. No one's going to remember that someone said this or that. It's just to get it up there and get a sense of the energy that we have in the room, all right? So the first question is about caring. And I suppose the fact that you're here, if I ask the question, how many people care about climate change? Can I have a show of hands? But again, like a lot, sort of, in down. So yeah, so we've got, actually that's really interesting. So some of you put your hand down. So who cares a lot? And and the rest of you are kind of maybe a little bit undecided. And I'm aware as well that we all have multiple things to engage ourselves with. And some people have no homes, some people have lots of things going on. So in terms of climate anxiety, could I just have a show of hands of how many people are feeling they're getting a bit anxious about it? Okay. And look around the room as well when the questions are being asked, just to get a sense. How many people are anxious for the next generation? That's interesting. More hands go up. Okay, thank you. How many of you are concerned about biodiversity loss specifically? Okay, so good show of hands. And this isn't a question now, but just how many of you are aware of the term solastalgia? Actually, you can put your hands up if you know it. Solastalgia? Yeah? So only 2 people in the room. So this is really interesting, I think, as a term. We all know about nostalgia, but solastalgia was a term coined by a philosopher called Glenn Albrecht, and I think it's brilliant. I'm going to read what he says. It's the homesickness you have when you are still at home and your home environment is changing in ways that you find distressing. Okay? So how many people here feel already that they're noticing their home environment changing and they're concerned about that? Okay. That's really interesting. So only about maybe 15, 20 people? So, I mean, I suppose I live in Ballybunion and I'm from the Midlands, but I nearly went hysterical the other day because I know we're probably going to flood at some point. I know on the maps it also, but the water almost came in. It came to the door and the gutters were breaking under the weight and there was a sea of water and I was out with a spade trying to dig a river away from the door and my partner was going, look at it, we knew it was going to happen. And I'm like, but not today. Not today. We spent a fortune trying to recycle a kitchen and make a new kitchen. I can't lose it today. And it's just, so I suppose it's that caring, Can I ask just as a show of hands, how many people here grow food? Even if it's only a lettuce on your balcony? Okay, quite a few. Great, 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 great. And how many people here would support farmers markets or try and be conscious of that? Fantastic. You're my audience. I love you all. This is great. And just as a matter of interest, how many people here have sat in a meadow, a native meadow, in the last, say, 6 months or a year? Oh, wow, so few, so few. Okay, do that. Do that before the grass is all cut. And how many people have sat in a woodland in the last 6 months? Okay, so woodlands are probably more accessible to people, and our meadows are very depleted. If you haven't read a book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, I would recommend reading that. How many people here would feel they know the names of trees and plants in your local area? Quite a few of you as well. So she talks about that and how important that is, because if we don't know the names of the plants and the trees, how will we know when they're gone? So I met a man, a farmer actually from Ballyduff, and he said to me, do you know what I'm going to do? He says, I'm going to learn the name of 3 plants a day. Sure, I thought, geez, you'll have an encyclopedia before Christmas. But I thought it was lovely that he was taking that on as a challenge. And how many people here feel that you're not doing enough, that you feel like you should be doing more? Yeah. And that can be quite overwhelming, can't it? So I suppose as you're listening to us talking and the questions, even if you could just decide I'm going to do one thing. And can I ask one other question? It's a bit contentious, but keep cups. How many people here have a keep cup? And I won't even ask you how many forgot to bring it today. But just, I did a climate literacy course last year. A brilliant woman called Susan Adams. If you haven't heard of her, check her out. She's running climate literacy courses all over the country. And I'd forgotten about, because with COVID, they were like, oh, don't bring your keep cups. But it's so important. You are supporting the oil companies every time you use plastic bottles, and they last for 400 years. So even if you did nothing other than out of today, except bring your keep cup and bring your bottle, that's an act of revolution in itself. It sounds basic, but stop giving them money and stop having these things that are around dumping the planet for 400 years. So look at, I suppose the reason I'm trying to think about care is because I believe that if we care, we'll start to do something. Too many people are disconnected, and too many people are being shafted by this capitalist system that's focusing on consumption, that is giving people no homes, and therefore they haven't the energy to care. But this room of people, you've all said you do care, and you maybe have a little bit of energy, and you have a capacity to take on the wider issues in the planet, and I think that's really important, because if we don't care, we never achieve the radical change that we actually have to achieve, and we know we have to achieve. And I suppose it's extraordinary to me, even in the face of the climate extreme weather events that are happening in Ireland, the amount of people who don't care or can't care. And if you're probably all familiar with Joanna Macy's work, are you? But check her out if you're not, Joanna Macy, and her, like the way she talks about business as usual. We cannot afford business as usual anymore. And again, as I said, it's not a judgment on people, but if we have the energy, we need to be the leaders on this. So I'm very glad to be in a room of people who are actually answering these questions really, really well. But I do think, just in terms of care as well, I think we need to be really careful about our mental health. And a lot of you are very active in your communities. And we need to build in systems to mind people's mental health in terms of climate change. Because I know a lot of you said that you didn't feel directly impacted. But if you're in rural communities and you're working with farmers, we're impacted every day. We're impacted every day by climate change. And everybody I know, so many people are going out of business and they can't afford to, do anything because they're losing their businesses. So it is a reality that a lot of people are affected by. And the second thing I want to talk about there was about community and connection. So can I have a show of hands of how many people here are connected to a community group or a few community groups? It might be a parents' association, GAA, any kind of groups outside of, say, the Social Democrats, because most people. Could we just have a shout out of we don't need to hear everybody, but just shout out together, like what groups are you involved in? How many people? GA? Yeah, a few. Parents associations? Yeah. LGBTQI, is anybody involved in? Yeah, fantastic. Gardening groups? Environmental groups? A few, only a few. That's very interesting. Any climate action groups? Yeah, 1 or 2. Okay, interesting, yeah. So I suppose the reason I'm saying that as well is because none of us are islands, and you're all going out of here today having heard lots and lots of information, and you are the mobilisers, and you are the catalysts for change. So when you go out, what messages do you want to give back to those groups? Because a lot of time people are standing around like school gates, and that's where the change needs to happen, A lot of stuff happens online, but it also needs to happen And I think as well, just to reiterate, I mean, I've done a lot of work on climate action with different groups, and it can be quite depressing. So we really need to build that community, and we really need to build those connections. And never underestimate the power of finding your tribe. Like when I was a child, I did not know, and it did not exist, a job where you could be an artist, you could be a farmer, you could be a climate activist. I mean, who would have thought those things were possible? Do you know, like, none of my parents went to college or anything, and I didn't even know that existed. So we're inventing jobs every day. And as I talked to the lads at lunchtime telling me about AI and there was going to be no jobs, but we can invent jobs, you know, and we can use our skills and talents to invent jobs. So the last one is creativity. Now, this is where I really want you to be honest. How many of you sing in the shower? Go on, there has to be more than that. You're dying to put your hand up, I can see it, you're sitting on it. But you know, and how many people sing around the house? Or with children? Fantastic, fantastic. How many of you are, that's a really big show of hands. How many people here sing professionally? Yeah, 1 or 2, 3, yeah? How many people here are writers who like to write? Even if you don't do it professionally, but you like to write. Fantastic. Poets, have we any poets? Super. And we've done singers. Artists, does anybody like to draw? Yeah, a couple of you. So the reason I'm listing those things is that sometimes, I suppose, when I was a community worker, it was like you're a community worker and you're fighting for justice and you're doing things. And we leave the artist part behind us. Do not leave the artist part behind you now. We really need it, because I'm going to talk to you about 3 projects now that I've been working on as an artist that I think have made more change than I ever made as a community worker. So it's really interesting. Don't lose that side of it. And never underestimate the power of art to transform situations. So if you have a creative gift, please use it to give a voice to nature and the creatures who need us to speak up for them. And I'm literally talking about drumming up support for nature in whatever gift that you have, whether it's singing, dancing, or anything else. So I'm going to talk very quickly about 3 projects. I've lost my time, I've buried me up. And I'm just going to talk to you about 3 little things that we do. So this is our farm, and this is our native. This featured, I have to say, on the front of the Farmer's Journal, myself and my lovely wife. Where's the field gun? There's us, the lovely lesbians down the lane. But I mean, to feature on the front of the Farmer's Journal, I think is amazing, for a field of rushes, really. But anyway, they didn't notice the rushes. Anyway, so I suppose in terms of care, community and creativity, I'm going to fly through these. In 2019, we planted 10,000 native trees on our land, much to the horror, because my wife used to own this land, but she bought this land from her uncle. And to plant trees on land as a farmer is a shocking thing to do. So it took 18 years, I think, of marriage before I persuaded her to, or not marriage, but a relationship. We had to fight for the marriage part. But, you know, to plant trees is a really big thing for farmers to do. So we run projects like the 30-day local food challenge in September, where we eat local food. And I've written 2 books. One is the Local Food Project and The Last Hug for a while, about COVID and climate change. We also work with people with disabilities on the farm. And this is us planting the trees. And we do Kerry social farming, so that's voluntary, where we work with people with disabilities on the farm. But what I suppose I'm trying to show you is that the justice, the climate, the biodiversity are all working together every day in the work that we do on the farm. And this is the little kitchen we renovated recently. And trying to recycle, always building new spaces. Like this was a dog kennel a year ago, and this, where these men are working, was a chicken run 4 weeks ago, but we were working with refugees from all over Africa, and it kept raining. So we were literally knocking walls, trying to make more space, because there was 21 men, and the little kitchen wasn't big enough. So this is literally, an eco art centre was built in 4 weeks. Never underestimate the power of intention and community. So, and I suppose just to go back to the men in terms of climate change, so here we are working with refugees on our farm, and some of the men were saying like they were sheep farmers, or they were different farmers in Africa, and they'd no rain for 3 years in North Africa, and they were thrilled to see the rain, and they didn't care about getting wet. And then just briefly, just to say, like, just about bringing people out into nature, I think is really, really important, because so many people are disconnected from it and don't get the chance. And then we set up a farmers market, the Ballybunion Community Market, in this beautiful space on the beach. And then I'm just going to talk to you about this other project, second project, Corcaguna and Vunaha, a creative imagining. So I don't know, how many people here are aware of the Creative Climate Action Fund? Okay, not too many. These are really significant fundings. There was about 200,000 euros projects. The last round, there was 15 of them. Now there's 43 projects. Some of them are 50,000, some of them are 250,000. They're big, sizable projects to work with small communities to bring about change in terms of climate change. So this is a project I did with farmers, and we were working on trying to work with 10 farm families to look at climate action. And we went on visits to different places. This is Father Ted's house in Cllr. We went, and I suppose the significant thing is it was about being the change. So I was the lead artist on the project. I walked to farms. I had to get down from Ballybunion to Dingle. It took me 6 hours on a bus. And then I would turn up on the farm walking. And I mean, you were talking about farmers, and sometimes there's a lot of resistance in farmers. I think the fact that they thought, she'll never give up on this. She's just going to stay walking, hiring electric bikes, bringing her own sandwich, local food, you know, telling how wonderful their polytunnels were. The trust that we built up over 2 years, we're still all connected, and the project is finished and there's no funding, but we're still all connected all the time, and they'll still be involved in things. And we went out in their farms and walked through the muck and went to show them other projects that were going on. We had lots of meals together. Everything we did was local food. We bought from the farmers. And, you know, there was no plastic at any event for a year, so don't let anybody tell me that you can't do it. It's totally possible. And then we looked at, after 6 months, we decided to do this, like, drawings about, well, what could we do? What change can we make? This is all available on learning briefs. I'll show you the links at the end, so you don't need to worry about it now. But it was like, what changes can happen inside the farm gate and outside the farm gate? Then, because Creative Ireland realised that this was really successful, we started with 10 farmers. We ended up with 25 people, children, parents, partners who wanted to get involved. We were invited to the National Ploughing Championship. They gave us a 100-foot wall from here to the end of the Taoiseach's tent to draw farmers' ideas about climate action. So we interviewed hundreds of farmers, and we drew, and the farmers came up from Dingle. It was brilliant. And these are the farmers, and we drew out all their ideas. And then they went, oh, this is gas. One of the farmers said, sell the farm and go to Ibiza. What was the most popular drawing on the wall? All of the young people, Instagram had this everywhere. And the irony was that my lovely drawing that was going to be the making of a career ended up running the last day because the rain was so bad, and I was devastated. So it actually dripped. But you know something, that was a really good thing as well, because the farmers really bought into it on the last day. They were like, you're still drawing even though it's raining. And it was really good, actually, even though it looked an absolute mess. So then that was transported to the Museum of Modern Art, and the farmers came up. And the really interesting thing about that was when the farmers came, there was no milk, because Emma decided to do a vegan site without thinking about the fact that it invited loads of dairy farmers and sheep farmers. So there was war. So now they call it Cowgate, and we're invited back again this year to do a screening of our film that we made. So we made a film, and we will be in Imma, the whole, like, farmers and myself, showing a film on the 23rd of September from 2 to 4. So please do come along to that, and you'll hear more about the project if you're interested. And then on my website, lisafingleton.com, and also on the Dingle 2030, there's loads and loads and loads of information and films. So there's plenty for you to look at after this if you're interested. And just very, very briefly then, this is the second last slide, I suppose never underestimate the power of vision and ideas, because we did that project in Dingle, and then I was thinking, sure, geez, we could do something in Ballybunion. So I decided I'd write an application for this round of Creative Ireland funding, and I wrote a 50,000 application for our farm. And then I was talking to the local community. I said, well, we put in the big 250,000 funding. And they were like, Asher, we'll do it. So we sat down with the community and we wrote a project that we'd love to do in Ballybunion. Boogies in the biosphere, dancing on the beach, celebrating in the forest, growing our own food, doing all sorts of exciting things, and we got it. And we're a tiny little coastal town. Yeah. So you know, just never underestimate the power of the singing that you have, the voice that you have, and just leading by example. Because the project's called Brilliant Ballybunion, and it's about leading the way and being, you know, transformative. So look I hope you have a great singing, dancing evening, and be the change you want to see in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our three speakers. That was a really, really excellent round of input from everyone. Thank you so much. Hopefully we have some time for some questions, so I'm going to throw it out to the floor if we have questions. Yeah, okay. I'll run up here.
Thanks so much. That was absolutely wonderful. I have a question about democracy. I guess, Mary, you alluded to it as being like instrumental, not just like a core value, but also a process by which we get there. And I can't help but feel a little bit, or I find it hard to struggle between like the importance of democracy and bringing everyone with us, and community, which you all referenced as making these changes like durable and lasting, but balancing that with like the speed at which we need to do a lot of the things, especially Sadhbh, you were mentioning like the technology, building huge wind farms, building lots of battery packs, just doing that at a huge speed. And I wonder how you think about the kind of contradiction or the difficulty in balancing giving everyone a say in the decision making and how we get there and where these wind farms get built versus the speed we need to achieve this with.
That's a great question, and it's a real challenge. I'm fascinated by just almost the intellectual problem of like how we can speed things up, and the temptation is, of course, to strip away environmental protection first. That's usually the first thing to go. So I've actually talked over the last few years to quite a lot of wind farm companies and wind farm developers. I mean, I know these projects, not necessarily the technology, sometimes the technology can be controversial, but this is the system as it is. These are private capital with public subsidies on private land. That's the system. Now, there are other kind of avenues and places for community projects, and parts of the renewable energy subsidy scheme have been set aside for that, and auctions and so on. But the main bulk of the wind and solar projects that will be developed will be privately owned. And so that's the first thing. I mean, do we accept that? If we accept that, then these companies have to obey the law. They have to get planning permission, they have to get their permissions and all the rest of it to connect to the grid. And sometimes those things are organized sequentially, and that's part of the delay. So by looking at those delays, you could possibly speed up the way they would get permission. But does that increase public acceptance? I think that's a whole other conversation. So talking to the wind farm companies, they say there's a huge amount of disinformation and misunderstanding. At a very basic level, people don't understand how wind turbines work. They don't understand that even if you're living in an idyllic community like Ballybunion, your electricity is not clean. You know, it's not clean unless it's coming exclusively from renewables. And people don't understand, because if they're living in a rural area where there isn't really any pollution from fossil fuel burning at scale, power plants, they don't make the connection. And the reason for that is they're not being told about it. So the Department of Climate Action has a variety of climate conversations and the National Dialogue on Climate Action. And I could talk all day about how inadequate and bad these schemes are. They're terrible. And they operate on what's called a sort of information deficit model, because they assume that people are black boxes that just need to be stuffed full of information and they're told what to think. That does not work. There's so much literature in psychology and social science to tell you that treating it as an information deficit model does not work to increase climate literacy. And the other problem is that they are motivated, these are the authorities that look after climate literacy, so to speak, are motivated to change people's behaviour. So they treat it as a kind of a marketing problem. So they get the ESRI in and they ask all these questions in opinion polls. Would you be willing to, put your clothes out on the line rather than in the dryer? That kind of stuff. And they treat it's like children, it's insulting. And yet at the same time, there is a lack of understanding. So how do we increase climate literacy? Well, I think that's over to you.
Well, it's really interesting that you talk about wind farms, because Ballybunion, actually, we do have a power station 20 miles from the town burning lots of nice stuff. And they are talking about bringing in, so we've had the big companies like RWE coming in, Greta Thunberg on one hand, and then coming to Ballybunion to look at wind farm sites. But I think that's where democratic deficit comes in, you know, where you've communities who are actually quite disenfranchised as well and don't feel they have a strong political voice. And then these companies come in, it's actually really frightening for communities, because here are we, on one hand, we have a special area of conservation where we have 140 dolphins. I always laugh, like Dingle has one dolphin, and look at, they've managed to create 30 years of, wow, tourism, and we have 140 and nobody even talks about them. So you know, we're trying to make people, but it is that dilemma then. You have this wind farm and everyone's like, well, of course we want renewables, but we don't want you to destroy a habitat for 140 dolphins. And then you have the democratic issue as well. So I really feel, that's why I was really interested in the previous panel on the far right and how we mobilise people to have a voice. And we have to keep the democratic process strong so people feel that they have a voice and that they can ask questions, and not these trite so-called consultations where they're trying to almost hide and run into a community and run out and say we did it. So yeah, I'm happy to talk to you afterwards if that's any help.
Hi, I just come in on that in terms of, like, I think, yeah, the democratic deficit is where it's at. And in Ireland, it's sort of, we're an odd kind of place when it comes to politics, because we do have higher levels of trust in our political institutions still than in some countries. So we are starting from maybe a place where we can build on it. But I think one of the biggest problems in Ireland in terms of trust and faith, if you like, in our institutions is actually local government is so poor in Ireland that nobody with any credibility would tell you that they could possibly trust the capacity of local government to implement and do anything right. And I say that as a previous Dublin City Councillor. Okay, so I'm not like giving out about anybody who's trying to make it work, but we, like the academic research couldn't be clearer that we are in the bottom 3 in the OECD for any kind of indicator of local government finance power, strength, legal capacity, implementation capacity. So I do think if we're going to enable people to trust that our leadership is going to be able to bring us through this, that we do have to build institutions that people can trust. So to some of that is about, I mean, we see RTE and what's going on there. My own university, Maynooth, is embroiled in a governance dispute at the moment. Some of our institutions really need to be fixed when it comes to basic power and our capacity to trust them to do the right thing. And I think the other thing I'd go back to saying is then, it does in a bit go back to, like, I did a lot of work during COVID on how did COVID change things. And one of the things that we realised is that it actually did accelerate the implementation of a lot of things like e-learning, for example, or e-health. But all of these things were in the pipeline, ready to go, okay? And I think that's what we'll see is the acceleration will happen because the urgency will be there to make it happen. But it will only happen for things that we're already in shape to do. So it's what are we planning now? What are we deciding now? What policies are we putting in place now that will really accelerate when time comes? So I think it's really important in the now that we're facing in the direction we need to face. And we're not necessarily, and I suppose the comment, Sadhbh, you were saying about that relationship between the market and the state, I think is really fundamental here. And there is an irony in what type of state do we need to be able to really regulate a market that we are giving a lot of power to and a lot of finance to as well to make that transition. And we don't have that right. Clearly the state is in the throw of the market now rather than the other way around. So some of the state institutions and their capacity to regulate at a central level need to change, but also particularly local government needs to change. Yeah.
I think we've one at the back, yeah. I don't know. I think my question went by. But we've been here for a day and a half. We've talked about lots of issues. This is the only session that matters. This is the only session that matters. When you asked for the show of hands, Lisa, you know, 3 weeks ago I was in Skibbereen, where I'm from, and I listened to Claire Watson talk about you and your wall in the ploughing. And I've listened to you again today. And nobody could leave your session depressed, by the way, just to say that. But when you asked about climate anxiety, people didn't put up their hands as much until we got to the next generation that they were worried for. I'm the mother of a climate striker, C. O'Connor. Sadhbh, you might know who I'm talking about. And I've been watching her the last 5 years. Friday was the 5th year anniversary of the start of the school strikes. 5 years. These children have been looking at their future and trying to motivate themselves to do anything, to go to school, to go to college, to build a life in the face of extreme climate anxiety. everyone in this room should have 2 hands up, and this is the only session that matters. Because if we don't solve this, that's it. I live in Skibbereen. I've been there 20 years. I went in, I tried to take control of the 5 acres that I moved into, my idyllic runaway from the rat race life. I spent the first 10 trying to plant, control, grow, and the last 5 trying to put it back the way I found it. And it is impossible, because the way I found it is gone. I used to walk through the fields and they hummed and they hopped, and I found biodiversity I'd never seen in my life before. And it's gone. So I just want to say this is the only session that matters. And I know it's not a question, and I'm sorry, but that's what I wanted to say.
Well, it's just fantastic to meet the Mother of Sea. I'm so thrilled. So hello from down here. But I just wanted to say something kind of personal. I am personally terrified. Because my job involves reading the science, I think the more exposure you have to it, the more frightening it is. And I think that might go to some way explain why people don't engage with it, because people are smart. They know that if they read it, there's no going back. There's no unknowing it. So that involves quite a careful conversation about how we talk to younger people and how we talk to people who might just be more vulnerable in terms of their mental health anyway, who'd be more inclined to react in a more extreme, anxiety way. But for me, I deal with the anxiety by acting and by being honest. Because this is, again, back to Cllr. The first thing they said was, we have to start telling the truth. Now, whether you like Cllr or not, I think that is an incredibly powerful moment. And Greta has done that as well, by speaking not just truth to power, but the truth. And the truth is that we are in a catastrophic crisis. And that even if we act, even if we do all the things the IPCC are telling us, we are still going to experience disasters, and they'll pop up here and there and everywhere. It'll be Hawaii one week, Pakistan the next, and guess which will get more attention, right? So the reality is that for some countries, it's an ongoing, slow onset crisis, and that's going to drive hunger, waves of migration, and death. And we are heading into a situation where the next wave of catastrophes over the next few years are going to be heat stress. People are going to die from the heat. So we have to face that. And how could you not be anxious? How could you not be upset and distressed? It's a perfectly normal human reaction. But there's a wonderful term I came across recently called the sensory landscape, which is everything you see around you. You see, you hear, you touch, whatever. You were not feeling, hearing, touching the climate crisis. You have to come on a Saturday to hear us talk about it, because it's not part of your daily routine. Maybe you don't listen to the radio anymore or the weather forecast or whatever. So where do you see or hear or touch the climate crisis in your sensory landscape? Because if it's not there, then of course people aren't going to act. Of course they're going to be able to carry on as if nothing is really wrong and that it's all just some crisis somewhere else. And it's only when it hits their doorstep will it turn into an issue, or when those nasty green politicians are trying to tax them, whatever. So it has to become part of our sensory landscape. It has to be part of our daily understanding of how we interact and experience the world and in our social relations. And until it is, people are going to be bottling up that climate anxiety all on their own. I have the privilege of not being on my own because I work with amazing people. I've only met Lisa today, but I'm in a community of people who are acting on this all the time. And that's the only way I can personally cope.
I think that's the perfect way to start to sum up our session. And again, you might just offer another round of applause for our guests, please, our panellists. I've been in many discussions, but today, more than anything, I'm hopeful. I'm more hopeful than when this session started, and that's thanks to your input and your inspiration and your enthusiasm. So again, just to offer my thanks to you and thanks to everyone for your participation. We'll call it up now. Yeah, we'll finish. All right. Thank you very much.